Hello and welcome to Presentation 6, the final presentation of Week 1, Defining Perspectives on Criminal Law and Acts. Originally, this was part of Presentation 5. However, there's a sufficient amount of information in here that we thought it would be best to sort of separate them out. But this is a bit of a continuation. Whereas in the last presentation, we focused on different approaches to defining deviance, in this presentation, we're going to look at different ways of understanding criminal law, criminality, and criminal acts. Criminal law is not a stationary thing. It's dynamic. It changes over time and is directly influenced by a number of factors: current events, politics, economics. New technology is actually a really important factor as well, especially in our modern society. A lot of our understandings of various issues are challenged, and a lot of our laws are challenged by digital technologies in particular. Let me give you an example. Is this woman being stalked? And who's stalking her? Almost every time I show this image to a group of people, they say, "Oh, watch out with the guy behind her." Well, how do you know that's the guy who's actually stalking her? Well, they normally say, well, it looks like she's on the corner, maybe she's waiting for a bus or whatever. That's possible. But maybe it's her brother or her boyfriend who's concerned because in the last 3 minutes she's received 7 messages from the same guy that she's trying to avoid. My point is that these technologies really challenge our understanding of things that we thought we understood, like stalking. What is stalking in this context? Is 7 messages on her cell phone an act of stalking? Well, that's a philosophical question, I suppose, or an ideological question, but the challenge for researchers is to try to find a way to make it an empirical question. I want to talk a bit about different ways of understanding or assessing what criminal law is. There are 3 critical functions of criminal law. The first is to discourage revenge. In a lot of societies, revenge is actually encouraged. As a matter of fact, it's expected. In the Western view, though, one of the functions of criminal law is to deter people from just going off and doing whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want, to people they perceived have done some wrong to them. In this image, this is a public execution where the man being executed is being executed by a gentleman on the right. In the image you have in front of you, it's from Mogadishu, Somalia, where the man on the right his father was killed by the fellow tied to the tree. You can see his hands in the lower left are tied, and he's taking a blade and he's slowly killing the other man. This is part of a revenge-oriented public execution. This is something that our criminal law in the West is explicitly designed to discourage. Another aspect of the criminal law is a way for society to express its perspective and codify it into what is acceptable or not acceptable behavior. In the image you see in front of you, there are 2 women who are in fact prostitutes who are advocating for prostitution to be legalized. Evidently in their jurisdiction it's not, but they want to change that. Lastly, the criminal law is used as a warning to other citizens to not to do whatever. And here's an example in New York of Bernie Madoff, the fellow who stole $60-some-odd billion from investors. And this is on a perp walk, as it's called, from the courthouse to the marshal's van to transport him to lockup. And frequently the justice system uses things like a perp walk, where it's sort of like a public shaming as you go to and from court or arraignment or whatever, as a way of warning other citizens you do not want to be like this guy. Additionally, there are different perspectives on how societies shape or define that which is criminalized. The more radical perspective, or otherwise known as the conflict perspective, is called the moving target perspective. And the moving target perspective ostensibly argues that the ultimate cause of crime is the law. In other words, according to this perspective, the elites in power define actions that they want to criminalize as criminal so as to keep the minority weak. So crime is an arbitrary, artificial thing, and it is only by happenstance when societies share laws that are same or very similar. The moving target perspective has been criticized for missing an incredibly important point, and the point is that even though a wide variety of human actions have been deemed criminal by a legislative body somewhere in the world, there are certain acts that are all but universally criminalized. For example, the intentional killing or injuring fellow members of one society are primary examples of a universally condemned criminal act. And this leads us to a different perspective that's more commonly held, or held by consensus, called the consensus perspective. And basically the idea here is that while every society has different ways of, per se, defining what is murder, what is burglary, what is robbery, and things like that, nonetheless, they all have some overlapping features or some overlapping behaviors that they regulate. And as you can see here, all these different societies overlap, and there's a stationary core in the middle that are considered the universally criminalized acts. Now, how do we distinguish between the core offenses, the ones in the precisely in the middle, versus everything else? There are two terms that are often used to make the distinction between the acts that are universally criminalized and acts that sometimes are and other times are not criminalized. The first one is mala in se, which means in Latin inherently bad or inherently evil. The other one is mala prohibita, which means, ostensibly, bad because they are prohibited. Most criminologists and researchers focus the bulk of their research and theorizing on the former, the mala in se crimes, rather than the latter, particularly for criminologists who specialize in studying offenses committed by juveniles rather than adult offenders. Is there any empirical evidence to support the stationary core perspective? Yes, there's actually been surveys and a tremendous amount of research done by a variety of researchers as well as Interpol. And Interpol, which is a collector of data from around the world, they're not a police agency, but their statistics are pretty clear, and they show that acts such as murder, assault, rape, and theft are all violations of criminal statutes in every single country. And yes, while there are variations in exactly what constitutes each of these offenses, most of these variations are minor or just very particular to the language or the culture which they emanate from. One of the things that is consistent among the, what are referred to as the universally condemned crimes are the fact that they are considered victimful, meaning there is an explicit victim, meaning that one person is the offender, one person commits a crime perpetrated against a specific victim or victims. These are victimful crimes, as opposed to something that we'll talk about a little later, which are considered victimless crimes. And those are crimes where both parties are said to be willing participants. We'll explore that a little later when we talk about things like prostitution and such, whether or not that actually is a victimless crime, but we'll get there. Even though most people in all societies condemn the core victimful offenses, legal statutes in virtually all societies are not confined to these crimes. Why not? Well, one reason seems to be to discourage people from advocating or even contemplating the commission of core offenses. For example, in many societies, it is not simply illegal to commit a murder or rob a bank, it is illegal to conspire with others to commit these acts. Similarly, truancy has been found to be associated with adolescent crime and drug use. This being the case, it is reasonable to assume that criminality and drug use can be curtailed somewhat by making truancy illegal. In these ways, the web of criminal laws in most societies extends far beyond the core offenses. Other criminal statutes have come into being to help, quote-unquote, protect health or improve sanitation. So other criminal statutes seem merely to support particular religious doctrines. One example are the so-called blue laws that make it illegal for taverns and other commercial establishments to be open on Sundays. There are even instances in which religious traditions sometimes exempt certain acts from coverage by criminal statutes pertaining to core offenses. For example, while it is always a core offense to kill members of one's own society at will, such actions are allowed in some various cultures as part of religious ceremonies. You see this especially in pre-literate African and Central American tribal societies, in which slaves and sometimes quote-unquote ordinary citizens were killed as ritualistic sacrifices to the gods. Not too dissimilarly, during the 16th and 17th century, officials of the Spanish Inquisition burned thousands of Jews and other so-called heretics for their failure to sincerely convert to Christianity. Now, there are three dimensions of criminality, which we're going to explore a little later. And what I'm asking you to do right now, if you haven't done so already, is download and print out this page that says three dimensions of criminality, because we're going to look at the details of this in a few more slides. Now, how do we separate the universally condemned crimes? Well, there's three characteristics. First is intentionality. Acts are rarely considered criminal if there's no evidence that the person involved in the act could have anticipated or would have desired the outcome. In other words, no matter how desirable an action might be, it is not considered criminal if it was beyond the control of the individuals involved. The only important qualification comes in the case of negligence, in which a, quote, reasonable person should have been able to anticipate a particular outcome, but chose to engage in an act anyway. Such acts are often considered criminal, although to a less degree than acts that are specifically intended. There are exceptions to this. There's something called vicarious liability. You see this with drunk driving, and those are acts where it doesn't matter what your intention was. The fact that you did it is sufficient in of itself. The second characteristic that separates the universally condemned crimes from others is victimization. Now, we're going to exclude from this defensive victimization, where you hurt somebody who's trying to hurt you in an act of self-defense. Necessary for an act to be considered criminal, though, is that it must have either injured or deprived somebody of his or her property or privacy. Such acts are called victimizing acts. And while societies vary somewhat in exactly how they define injury, property, and privacy, there's such a sufficient commonality across societies that the details and the nuances need not concern us here. The only major exception to criminalizing all victimizing acts comes in the case of an act that is purely defensive in nature. If injuries result simply as part of an act of self-defense or defense of a third party, it will rarely be considered criminal. Now, there's a really interesting debate about whether or not certain acts that are considered victimless, whereas two parties are engaging in the behavior such as gambling or prostitution, whether or not there truly is a victimless crime. And I and a lot of other criminologists are really quite open to this discussion. However, from a criminal statute point of view, there's an assumption that, say in the example of prostitution, one person is buying and one person is selling, and if the other person actually isn't selling but the other person is taking, then it's called a rape. But nonetheless, reasonable people can disagree on whether or not it's reasonable or right to characterize prostitution, given the totality of circumstances surrounding acts like that, whether or not it is actually a victimless crime. The last characteristic has to do with the exclusion of non-group members. Criminal statutes are normally applied to persons residing within a prescribed geopolitical boundary, a jurisdiction. By making a distinction between insiders and, quote, outsiders, it is possible to harm others and destroy their property in times of war without fear of criminal prosecution. Okay, so to test how well you are following all these arguments on the previous slides, consider the following 6 crimes. 3 fall under the category of universally condemned offenses, and 3 do not. Which ones do you think are or are not? Think about it for a second. Okay. If you guess that the second column on the right contains core offenses, then you understand the distinction that has just been made. To summarize, if an act intentionally causes injury, property loss, or a loss of privacy to fellow group members, and this was not the result of self-defense or defense of another, and it occurred within the geopolitical boundaries or jurisdiction of where the statutes were enacted, then the act will be universally condemned, with very few exceptions. Remember that drawing I asked you to download and take a look at? Let's take a look at that in greater detail. I said earlier in a previous presentation that a simple definition of criminality has to do with the desire to commit a deviant or a criminal act. We're going to just nuance this a little bit and say that, you know, how bad, quote unquote, a crime is, or what level of criminality is associated with the badness of that crime, can be assessed by looking at it from 3 different dimensions. And this illustration will help us do that. The first is the victimizing dimension, which is on the bottom. And this pertains to the degree to which there is an identifiable victim. And there are three categories. First are victimful offenses, which are crimes for which there is an obvious intended victim, such as most murders and rapes. Then you have marginally victimful offenses, which are crimes in which victimization comes from as a result of carelessness, such as negligent manslaughter. And then you have victimless offenses, crimes in which all participants in the criminal event is voluntary. Again, we can debate all day long about whether or not prostitution truly is voluntary and whether or not little girls in particular grow up wanting to be a prostitute. A lot of times you ask little boys what they want to be: soldier, a doctor, a lawyer, something like that. Things that are positively viewed by society. Most girls do not grow up wanting to play with the prostitution Barbie doll. The first specific reference to victimless crimes was made in the 1960s, and basically the distinction between it and victimful crimes has to do with harm to an unwilling victim. If there is such harm, the crime is victimful. If not, it is victimless. The distinction between victimful and victimless crimes is fairly close to the much older legal concepts of mala in se and mala prohibita. Other terms that you sometimes see are predatory versus non-predatory crimes, or non-consensual and consensual. Of course, not all crimes fall neatly into one or the other of these two categories. Statutory rape, for example, refers to the act of a, quote, adult having sexual intercourse with a child. Quote, if the child, who often may be 14 or 15 years old, has consented to intercourse, statutory rape would not be a victimful offense. However, there is still a sense in which, quote, the child is still being exploited or victimized by an older, more experienced person. Several other sex offenses are only marginally victimful in nature. As to why so many acts without any obvious victims have been and continue to be criminalized, well, there's a lot of different debates actually as to why that is, and there is no consensus to it. Moving into more details about victimless offenses, or victimless crimes, are usually subdivided into status and non-status offenses. Status offenses, also called age-contingent offenses, are crimes such as truancy or drinking under a prescribed age, which are illegal for persons under a certain age but are not for those beyond that age. Now, by the way, different states will use this term status offenses differently. I know here in Louisiana we use it slightly differently than the way I'm explaining it to you. However, I'm using these terms in the way that social scientists use them, not lawyers or attorneys. The other subdivision of victimless crimes are non-status victimless crimes, which include such things as illegal gambling, prostitution, drug possession, which are deemed criminal or not criminal regardless of age. The next dimension at the top is the political dimension. Now, I've already commented earlier on that political forces and political ideologies underlie both the creation and enforcement of criminal statutes. Therefore, for this reason, special consideration is given to crimes that threaten to destabilize government itself. Thus, offenses such as assassinations and espionage are not just murders and thefts. They are political offenses. Because political offenses directly threaten the very institutions that make civilized life possible, including the existence of criminal statutes themselves, these offenses are usually dealt with more harshly than the same crime that has no political motivation. Another category of political crime is one in which governmental actions themselves cause harm to citizens. These are really quite difficult to prosecute in most societies, however, because control over the legal arena in which the crime must be proven is controlled by the government being charged. Now, there are intermediate types of crimes that need to be recognized. Certain crimes seriously threaten government stability, even though this threat may not be what is motivating those who commit the offense. For example, counterfeiting money. A universal government function is the creation of money, and when you counterfeit it, it undermines the stability of the currency. Rioting and looting are also called quasi-political crimes because even though the intention might be to steal and damage, when you're rioting and looting, it's done so on such a mass scale that if the government can't control it, it undermines the capacity for the government to maintain law and order. Most criminologists study non-political crime. As you can see from the serious dimension, that as you go more towards victimful and more towards the political end of things, you have what are considered the more serious or the crimes with a greater level of criminality. Well, I know it was a lot, and I hope you enjoyed these presentations. But for now, that's all, folks.